Facebook is live.
You're good to go, Steve.
Good afternoon. My name is Steve Lett, and I am the acting chair of the commission for today and tomorrow. I call this afternoon session of the meeting of the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission to order. And I would ask that Sally would call the roll, please.
Absolutely. Commissioners, when I call your name, please unmute yourself and say present. Anthony Eade.
Present.
Brittany Kellum.
Present.
Cynthia Orton.
Present.
Douglas Clark.
Present.
Dustin Whitgift.
Present.
Aaron Wagner.
Present.
James Decker.
Present.
Janice Villette.
Present.
Juanita Curry.
Present.
MC Rothhorn.
Present.
Rhonda Lang.
Present.
Richard Weiss.
Present.
And Stephen Lett.
Present. Thank you,
All
Sally.
commissioners are present.
Thank you. For those of you that are just joining us, a few of the housekeeping items. We are live streaming this on Facebook and YouTube, if that's where you're looking at us. For anyone in the public watching who would prefer to watch via a different platform than they are currently using, you can visit redistrictingmichigan.org or at redistrictingmi to find the link for either viewing on YouTube or Facebook. Our live stream today includes closed captioning. If you need to avail yourself of that, please do so. You might already see that we have ASL interpretation available for the meeting. If you are a member of the public watching who would like easier viewing options for ASL interpreter on your screen, please email redistricting@michigan.gov, and we will provide you with additional viewing options. Similarly, members of the public who would like access to translation services during the webinar can email redistricting@michigan.gov for details on how to access language translation. Services for this meeting. Translation services are available both in Spanish and in Arabic. For the purposes of the public watching and the public record, I will turn to the Department of State staff to take note of commissioners present, and we already did that, so the roll call is done. As you can see, the agenda is on your screen, and we will be following along with that. First, we have an introductory presentation on our role as commissioners. I would like to recognize Department of State staff who will have the floor for approximately 40 minutes.
Good afternoon, commissioners. Thank you, acting chair. Hope you all had a nice lunch break. We all know each other well by now, but for members of the public who might be just joining us for the first time, my name is Sally Marsh, and I'm the Director of Special Projects at the Michigan Department of State. And Mike Brady, are you with us? We can't hear
Can
you,
you hear
Mike.
me, Sally?
Oh, yes, we can hear you now.
I'm having some issues with my video, but at least you can hear me. So I'll continue trying to work on the video.
Thanks, Mike. Do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, this is Mike Brady, Chief Legal Director at the Michigan Department of State.
Great. So while Mike works on his video, I'll just quickly mention, Mike and I have been working along with other staff at the department for over a year now to unpack this constitutional amendment. And as we have talked to people throughout the application process, many recurring questions and themes have been asked on what really the role of a commissioner is and what commissioners should expect if selected. So we are going to talk through 3 general buckets of information and questions that we think all of you commissioners might have based on the conversations we've had in the past. Responsibilities and expectations, timeline, and government structure and budget. Commissioners, you might want to flip to page 18 of your orientation materials, which is where the text of the Constitution starts, because we will be referencing that constitutional language along the way. We're happy to take questions as we go in the chat, or of course, at the end, happy to be here to be a resource. Note that after this session, you will hear from academic experts about mapping and criteria and that element of the process. So Mike and I will stick to administrative items. So on to the next slide. And Mike, you're able to see the slides still, even if we can't see your video? Okay, great.
Yeah, apologies to everyone.
No worries, no worries. So the first thing that we want to talk about is conduct and what is mentioned in terms of conduct in the constitutional amendment. Each commissioner, it says in the Constitution, each commissioner shall perform his or her duties in a manner that is impartial and reinforces public confidence in the integrity of the redistricting process. We thought it might be helpful to lift up that language to all of you this afternoon, because you've now entered into your role as commissioners and as public servants. And the Constitution does kind of mention this specific call for all of you in being impartial and reinforcing integrity in this new process. The next slide talks about consensus, it talks about autonomy. So Secretary Benson touched on this, but it is worth repeating that the commission shall elect its own chairperson, as you all did temporarily earlier today, but certainly will do in a more permanent way after you have the opportunity to discuss your operating structure. And you really are autonomous. You have the ability to make your own rules of procedure. These are all direct quotes from the Constitution. The commission shall have procurement and contracting authority and may hire staff and consultants for the purposes of this section, including legal representation. So again, you all are autonomous, you are in the driver's seat and able to approach your charge with that level of autonomy. Mike, do you want to briefly touch on eligibility and term length?
Absolutely, happy to. So eligibility certainly was an important criteria, especially in the last 18 months, almost 2 years now, in setting up the process and creating the application and doing all the things that you all obviously did, that resulted in you filling out the application, having those reviewed to confirm that folks had, that only the applications that stated that that answered the questions consistent with being eligible, moved on through the various random selections. To recap that briefly, just perhaps, certainly for your benefit as a reminder, but especially for the public's benefit, that in order to be a commissioner, in order to serve on this commission, there's one statement, there's one requirement of what you have to be, and then there are various things that you're not allowed to be. The one that you have to be is you have to be a registered and eligible voter in the state of Michigan. And then the various things, and of course, this is found in Article 4, Section 6, 1B, says, you're not allowed to have been any of the following things in the last 6 years. And this would be, looking through that, it's first and foremost a declared candidate for partisan federal, state, or local office. Second would be an elected official to partisan federal, state, or local office. Third would be an officer or a member of the governing body of a national, state, or local political party. Fourth is a paid consultant or employee of a federal, state, or local elected official, political candidate, various others. The fifth is an employee of the legislature. The sixth is any person who is registered as a lobbyist agent with the Michigan Bureau of Elections or any employee of such person. And then the seventh restriction is an unclassified state employee who is not exempt from classification in state civil service. This is actually kind of, I don't know if it's necessarily a double negative, but there's a kind of someone who doesn't fall within the exception to state classification. And then it says except for employees of court records, employees of state institutions of higher education, and persons in the armed forces of the state. And then, beyond that, it also says that you cannot have been a parent, a step-parent, a child, a stepchild, or a spouse of any individual disqualified under any of the different sections that I just read. And so all of that was laid out in the application, and each of you checked boxes accordingly, making clear that none of those restrictions applied to you. And for that reason, your application proceeded in June to the first of the random selections that happened this summer. As you see on the slide, the term length, it doesn't have a specific time frame because it notes that it's really tied to the work itself. So the term of the commissioner shall expire once the commission has completed its obligation for a census cycle, but not before any judicial review of the redistricting plan is complete.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to try asking you to turn on your video and see if that works. And then we'll go on to the next slide in the meantime. Okay, great. So moving on to the other constitutional expectations, one of them is consensus. So there are a few points at which the constitutional amendment the Constitution talks about consensus and agreement across political party affiliation. I've listed them here. If it's small on your slide, that's totally fine. You can look in the written application or the written Constitution, or we'll of course make these available afterwards. But just to kind of note these different consensus criteria. Page 21 of the Commissioner's Guide to Redistricting in Michigan that was provided in your orientation materials. It's the document that starts with the big purple cover. That page has some really helpful illustrations of these different consensus criteria. So just to kind of walk through them briefly, a final decision of the commission requires a majority of commissioners. This makes sense, right? That's sort of a logical requirement. The other two pieces across party affiliation are worth noting: that a decision on the dismissal or retention of staff requires the vote of at least one commissioner who affiliates with each party affiliation, and of course one who doesn't affiliate with either major party as well. And then sort of building on that, a final decision of the commission to adopt a redistricting plan requires a majority vote, of course, but then that has to include at least two commissioners who affiliate with each party affiliation. And so there is a provision in the Constitution to break a stalemate if there is one in this department, but hopefully you all don't have to utilize that option and are able to find consensus between and among different party affiliations that are represented here today. If we can move on to the next slide, a couple of notes about transparency, and we'll be talking about this more tomorrow as well. but there are several explicit requirements about transparency in the constitutional amendment. It details open meetings with advance public notice that, quote, invites wide public participation throughout the state. It also requires live stream or other technology to provide contemporaneous public observation and meaningful public participation in the redistricting process in all meetings and hearings. That's part of what we're trying to do today. And all decisions of the commission must be recorded, and the record of those decisions need to be made readily available to any of the public without charge. So these are, like I said, explicit requirements for transparency in the work that you all will do that's laid out throughout the constitutional amendment.
And just a note there, Sally,
Mm-hmm.
this is Mike Brady again. With respect to the open meetings with advanced public notice, we'll send along a link to this as well. The commission, as a body of the legislature, is actually subject to the Open Meetings Act, which is certainly consistent with all these things. But there are some resources that we'll send along for you all for your own reading, just become familiar with, just to give you a sense of some of the rules that exist and that can provide guidance to you all as you move forward as a public body in the state of Michigan.
Thanks, Mike. Mike, do you want to build on that point in terms of communication?
Absolutely. So the Constitution says, the commission, its members, staff, attorney, and consultants shall not discuss redistricting matters with members of the public outside of an open meeting of the commission, except that a commissioner may communicate about redistricting matters with members of the public to gain information relevant to the performance of his or her duties if such communication occurs in writing or at previously publicly noticed forum or town hall open to the general public. So this is actually takes it a step further, at least a step further, from the Open Meetings Act, which would govern the activity of the public body itself, and that would require the Open Meetings Act is triggered when you have a quorum of the public body. So in this case, the public body is 13 members, so quorum would be 1 plus 50%. So this would be 7 people is quorum here. But the language in the Constitution says that that even discussing some of the matters between any member of the commission and a member of the public outside of the open meeting of the commission is problematic. And so just kind of flag that as being, again, beyond the usual restrictions that would exist in the Open Meetings Act.
Great, thanks, Mike. And then just to mention, and we'll talk about this more tomorrow as well, but there is explicit mention in that same section that no gifts of money, goods, or services that may influence your duties can be accepted as a commissioner now that you are in this role. So before we move on to compensation and timeline, wanted to answer a couple of frequently asked questions that we've gotten a few times over the past couple of months and really over a year. So Mike, I'm wondering what would happen if a commissioner is no longer able to serve for any reason?
So the Constitution anticipated that, and it says, I'm pulling up my trusty Constitution, that there'd be, as I recall, it's another selection from those individuals who made it the same in, so we do another selection out of those folks who made it to August. And so if the person who was no longer able to serve stepped on, if they were someone who was unaffiliated perhaps, then we would go to those people who were made it through the legislative review in July, and then we're part of the remaining pool of unaffiliated candidates from which you all were randomly selected, and we would draw another unaffiliated person from that pool of individuals. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, so for example, if somebody on the commission had to resign and provide their letter of resignation to the Secretary of State for any reason, then the person who would replace them would be randomly selected from the pool of people who remain. So as Mike just kind of outlined, if it's somebody who was, for example, unaffiliated, it would be randomly selected from the unaffiliated remaining pool of that 180 or at this point, 160 plus individuals. And same thing with any of the other party affiliations. And then another really frequently asked question that we've gotten is, what's the time commitment? What's our schedule? And I know that even some of you have asked that over the past several weeks. And the answer to that, as you all know, but just to reiterate, it's really up to you. You decide what the schedule will be. You have complete autonomy, and the best guidance that we have been able to give on that has actually been from commissioners from California who did a similar experience to the one that you all will be doing it for the first time in California back in 2010, 2011 redistricting cycle. And they will be presenting to you later today, a few of them. And so if you have any more questions about what their lives looks like and what the commitment was like, I'm sure they'd be happy to answer those questions for all of you. And the last question, Mike, I wanted to pose to you is, should commissioners be worried about lawsuits?
No, I wouldn't worry about the lawsuit. About lawsuits. Lawsuits will happen inevitably. Some of that perhaps just is the litigious nature of society, this day and age. That said, to look at even setting that aside, the kind of important work that you all are doing tends, just the reality of it, in various states, almost regardless of, which format or who's in power or anything else, someone's going to file a lawsuit, and lawsuits are filed, in lots of different contexts. Not all lawsuits are successful, of course. And I think the key here is just that if you proceed transparently and you remain thoughtful in your consideration and deliberation, and you work as a group, you're all going to be fine. And the work of this commission itself will also be fine. Some of the slides we just went over in terms of transparency, in terms of, the rules about communication, the rules about not accepting gifts, the rules about, the various other things that we just touched on in the last few minutes. Those I think are really, they're not simply rules in the Constitution. They're the right thing to do, and they're what the people of Michigan expect of all of you. And when you're following those rules, you and your work in turn is going to be protected, and it will work out.
Thanks, Mike. All right.
Sally, this is Doug. Can I ask a question on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do we need to be concerned on the lawsuit issue? Do we need to be concerned about our work or parts of our work being discoverable and not discoverable? And how do we protect against that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just to define the term, because I don't know if perhaps other members of the commission may not be familiar with the term discoverable, or perhaps, if you are, then I'll just say it for the benefit of the public. So that is to say, could they come up in the context of a lawsuit? Could someone, ask to see, the written work product that you have, emails, text messages, other things along those lines, really any records you have related to this? Absolutely. We have a session on that at some point. Is that tomorrow afternoon, Sally?
Tomorrow morning. You got it.
Oh, tomorrow morning. Forgive me. Certainly a lot of different things, but it's a great question. We'll go into more detail then, along with some specific ideas of what you can do to, to upfront, along those lines, perhaps creating a distinct email address or other things to separate out the work from the personal. but again, more on that tomorrow.
Okay, great. That's perfect. Okay.
And the only thing that I would just add to that, Doug, is that I think that's also a great example of the type of questions or consultation that you all might be considering in terms of hiring legal representation or hiring, people who can help you navigate some of those types of issues.
Okay, great.
Great. And we'll have more time for additional questions as well in a few minutes, but just wanted to kind of continue on and talk about, like I said, both the government structure and budget compensation elements, and then of course the timeline as well. So Mike, would you like to talk about the structure?
I'd be happy to. So as you've heard, you may have seen in some of the other materials as well, the Secretary of State is the Secretary without a vote, as Secretary Benson had acknowledged this morning as well. That said, the Constitution, envisions a role of us providing support to you all at your direction and explicitly under your direction, providing technical services that you all may deem necessary. So the technical services, I think, certainly from Secretary Benson's perspective, want that to be as supportive as we can be. Again, with certainly emphasizing that the key point here, which is that all of that is supporting your work and being done at your direction, so that we can certainly have any conversations now or later on at any time of what things that you might need assistance with, and you can just ask, is that something you all can help with? And if we can, I know the direction from the Secretary is that we want to be as helpful as possible. Offhand, obviously, it could include posting notice for future public meetings, arranging for Zoom setup and other things like this. There are all sorts of various other things as well that come up just with the operation and organization of really any entity that again, we want to be as supportive as possible on. Additionally, you see here notes that the Secretary shall keep the public record of all proceedings and shall publish and distribute each plan and required documentation. So, we are keeping notes on this meeting. We'll prepare a draft minutes for circulation and review to the Commission at its next meeting. Tomorrow, to be clear, is actually a continuation of this meeting. It will be adjourning this afternoon. You all will be adjourning this afternoon. But after these 2 days, this one meeting ends, we'll create draft minutes for you all for your review, consistent with our role as the Secretary of the Commission, and then proceed accordingly with that. Sally Marsh had also noted earlier that this is being recorded and the recording will be maintained. It's also being transcribed, and that transcription will also be retained. And both of those, of course, are important forms of public records that'll be made available to the public as soon as we have them in a version and format that we're able to put on our website. So there's another piece here on the same slide, body of the legislature. Just wanted to note that you all are a body of the legislature. There may be sort of a question of so what does that mean? Well, to be clear, this isn't, you are all, part of an independent Citizens Redistricting Commission, and your independence is not changed by, by this commission being located in the legislative branch versus the executive branch. In case some of you are curious, I can offer more later on, but just to say, it's a little bit of the background, having spoken with the people who drafted the constitutional amendment, to understand, the thought process behind all of that. They really, in an effort to make this commission more independent, they moved it into the legislative branch so that it would not be able to be touched by any of the governor, and again, that's not this governor, that's any governor's broad powers of reorganization that exists under the state constitution. So they wanted to keep it outside of the executive branch for that reason, and instead putting it into the legislative branch. As a practical matter, I'm not sure it has huge implications. I suppose we'll see as you guys are the inaugural commission. One practical thing that I wanted to flag for you all is simply that your budget, the budget that is appropriated to the commission each fiscal year under the terms of the Constitution, that budget is actually located within the legislature's budget. And so, we've already had some initial conversations just with the legislature about, if there's any guidance that we'd be able to relay to you all about what that might mean for you in terms of how you all access your budget. And I think, that may come up, as well, but that's been a frequently asked question along the way, and certainly one that we've received already from many of you commissioners in your conversations, I believe, primarily with Sally Marsh. And so wanted to just be able to say that kind of started some of those questions to the legislature to say, how do legislative bodies access their budget? Because we're, of course, not, we, the Department of State, are in the executive branch, not the legislative branch.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, and just to kind of further elaborate on that, as you'll see on the slide here, but more importantly, as you can read in the Constitution, your budget and the allocation of your budget, the appropriation of your budget, is not something that you'll have to advocate for in the same way that another body might have to. It's written into the text of the constitutional amendment that you will be appropriated the budget. It's an amount pegged off of the amount that is allotted to the Secretary of State, and that also, of course, includes your compensation as well. If you want to go to the next slide, your compensation is that each commissioner shall receive compensation at least equal to 25% of the governor's salary. Right now, based on the current governor's salary, that's a little bit under, right about $40,000 total. And so some of what Mike was talking about in terms of accessing funds is really just the sort of minutia of internal government. But the bottom line is you're allocated a budget that you have full autonomy to utilize, and you are also guaranteed compensation at least equal to 25% of the governor's salary. So quickly, before we'll break for questions, any questions that you all might have, I wanted to mention the timeline. This draft timeline that's on the screen is a shorter version of what's included on page 11 of your orientation materials. I just wanted to note a few things here, and you'll hear more about this in the next panels. One is that there are at least 2 rounds of mapping and public hearings that you all will have to engage in. So you may have heard the, at least 15 public hearings are required by the Constitution. That's true. It's actually even more specific than that. It's at least 10 in the first round of public hearings, and then at least 5 in additional public hearings that you all engage in after you complete your initial maps, or your sort of initial maps for consideration to the public. So those are 2 important constitutional requirements to keep in mind when you're thinking about how the overall timeline of your work should proceed. And then the other things are really the last 3 bolded bullets on this slide, which is that no later than September 17th, 2021 is when you'll have to have those final maps complete and proposed for a vote, which allows for a 45-day period of public comment. That's required in the Constitution. And then by November 1st of 2021, that's the deadline for adopting maps that will then take effect no later than December 31st, 2021. So as you think about what the next year and a little bit extra, a little over a year will look like, those are some of the key constitutionally required dates and criteria to keep in mind. And like I said, you will hear more about the public hearings portion in the next panel discussion that you'll hear about. But part of the advantage of convening now and convening early is that you have time to think about these requirements and determine your schedule, both in the short term and the long term, for what will, in all likelihood, be at some points a bit of a last minute crunch or some additional work in order to meet the deadlines that are laid out here. And so those are the main kind of constitutional expectations and criteria that we wanted to touch on with you as an intro to what's expected in your role as a commissioner. And I think we have a few minutes left for any questions you all might have. So if there are any questions, Mike and I are happy to try to answer.
This is Doug. Can we go back to the last slide for a minute?
Yes, I'm sure Kathleen is on it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kathleen.
I don't see it yet.
Kathleen, we can see your desktop.
What's that?
I was just saying to Kathleen that we can see her desktop, but not her slides.
Well, let me see if I can do it off memory. There's 2 rounds. Okay, of
Mhm.
mapping. Okay. Is round 1 like a straw man where we map and get something mapped out how we think it should be, and then get public input from that, and then make adjustments on the next round of mapping to finalize it? Or is that up to us to decide as we move forward?
It's a great question. I'll try to start answering it. I mean, it's certainly up to you all to decide, how to handle it moving forward. That said, what the next panel will talk about are the requirements for these public hearings and determining what communities of interest are. You all might have heard that term in the orientation materials that were circulated to you. So what will likely be important, and I think what you can see in some of the requirements in the Constitution for those public hearings and those different rounds of public hearings, is the idea that you're taking in input from the public and inviting a wide range of participation from people across the public in order to draw even your initial set of maps. So I think what you described is along those lines, but if you look at those portions of the Constitution, those rounds are I think a big part of facilitating the public input and public participation in your process.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions? I know a lot of that material is stuff that you've already read in your orientation materials, but of course, moving forward throughout the rest of this meeting or into the future, if you have any questions that we can be helpful with. Oh, I see your hand, MC.
I was just thinking that maybe the first public input we got was this morning. And I was just thinking about how we get in touch with Nancy Wong, because I believe she mentioned communities of interest and having had some contact with them. And so I guess the question may be, will that be part of the public record and how to reach out? Or is that something that we as commissioners would reach out or try to get in touch with her as individuals, or how would that work?
That's a great question. And Mike, feel free to chime in, but people who submit public comment have the ability to give you really their contact information. And so, I think the short answer to your question is yes. You'd be able to invite people to provide more information or provide background or talk to you all really at any point in the process as part of one of your public meetings. And that's some of what we're doing today in terms of having, and tomorrow, in terms of having experts come and talk to you all. It's really the beginning, not the end of your opportunity to do that.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that you can certainly invite somebody to come back and, provide further testimony or, be on the agenda or, submit something in writing. Part of the idea is that I mean, to be clear, hopefully you have, hundreds, if not thousands of people over the course of the next year who, send you their version of a map, send you, written comments, write you something. And again, I'm emphasizing, in this particular statement, just the written word as something that creates that record for you, as opposed to, obviously folks will speak to you as well, and you should take notes on those things. But it's not going to, it won't be practical for every person to kind of come back later on or whatever else. So the goal would be, the hope would be that when they address you in writing or in person, or speak to you, that they're offering to you as much as they can at that moment, so that you can take notes and then, just make a little note. Oh, here's a dynamic that I wasn't familiar with. There's a, whatever it is, this particular group or this particular, geography has this kind of concern or this kind of interest. And then that may lead you to other questions or other research or other things for staff or other research, for your lawyers or demographers or anything else that come up down the road. And so, as an aside, I mean, Ms. Wang is obviously very involved in this, and I'm sure you'll be hearing from her again, just on her own initiative. But just to say, the last thing would be, if you were to reach out to her or somebody else, and I know I said this before, and forgive me, but just kind of, hit on the point that since the question would really be about the core work of this, that it would really have to be about inviting her to come back and maybe even putting her on the agenda to speak to all of you, because you can't have that conversation as an individual. So.
If there are no more questions, we are almost at our break time, and this will allow Sally to work on the next panel that will be coming. So we'll take a little more than 5 minutes. We'll be back here at 2:50. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So for the public watching, while our commissioners and hopefully you all take a break, this is when our Department of State staff will make sure that our panelists are ready to go for the upcoming panel. I think I see John is here. John, if you'd be able to unmute yourself so we can make sure your microphone works at your convenience, that would be great.
Now, you hearing me?
Hi, Professor Chamberlain. It does sound a bit faint, but I can hear you.
I wonder if it's, may go down to the volume command, maybe.
Can the other panelists who are here, can you unmute and so we can see if your audio is working?
Hi, this is John Eguia. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
And
Great.
this is Matt Grossman.
Hey, Matt.
Hi.
Is my sound level better now?
That is better.
Okay.
Still a little quiet, but much better. And this might be just me, but John, not John Chamberlain, but John, I don't think I can see you anymore. Would you be able to try turning on your video?
I still see John. I
Okay.
still see both. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah,
That's just me then.
I'm supposed to be on.
Okay, good. Let me try this again. Oh yes. Oh good. I see you. Here, and let me edit your name. are you all ready to go? Anything we need to test out before the commissioners return?
So they'll, if during the part where they're supposed to type questions, they'll just type it into the chat, and then what will happen?
Yes, I think either that they will raise their hand. Can you see them all, Matt? Do you have it set up so you can see everybody?
Not
can
right
you
now
only
because
see a
you're
few?
sharing the screen.
So if you go up to the top where it says you're viewing Kathleen Simlar's screen,
Yeah.
next to that, it's under view options. There's a side-by-side mode.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And then you can drag that bar over and see a lot of people at once.
Oh, okay. Got it. Okay. And so they'll just use the raise hand function.
Yeah, they'll either Steve, we can hear you, but we can't see you yet.
I know you guys are not letting me turn myself back on.
How's that?
There we are. Okay, we're back. Thank you all for being back promptly. As an attorney, whenever the judge said we were going to take a 10-minute break, that meant 30. However, we're going to operate if it's 5 minutes, it's 5 minutes. Okay, we've had one panel discussion and we're up for the next one. And the moderator is Matt Grossman. Matt, you're on.
Thank you so much. We are very excited about the opportunity and responsibility you've been given, but also in awe of the project of coming to consensus across all of you all, but also across a lot of competing criteria that experts even disagree on. So today is mostly introductory. But this is our opportunity to kind of get into the substance of redistricting, the issues at stake, and the process that you'll be undertaking. This panel is also mostly Q&A, so we've tried to pare down the opening remarks. So please interject for the start if you could put your questions in the chat box if they're clarifying, and then as soon as they're done with the opening, we'll move to direct questions. So we want to know what's on your mind and how we can help, but this isn't your last opportunity. This is just the beginning. So John Chamberlain is going to start with an overview of the structure and process. John is Professor Emeritus of Political Science and Public Policy at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. His research is on ethics and public policy and methods of elections and representation. And he's the former director of the University of Michigan Center for Ethics in Public Life. John, why don't you get us started?
Thank you, Matt. There we go. Good afternoon to the commissioners. I'm pleased to be joining your meeting as Michigan embarks on a new era of redistricting that will improve the quality of representative government in our state. Until this year, redistricting was a very top-down process driven by parties, legislators, the governor, and their allies. There was no transparency. Everything was done behind closed doors. There was no meaningful public participation. There were few constraints on the process beyond federal law. And too often these conditions resulted in a gerrymander, a partisan gerrymander when one party controlled both the legislature and the governorship, some form of an incumbent gerrymander when control was split. Things are very different now. Starting now, redistricting will be vastly different and will yield rather much fairer redistricting plans. Michiganders themselves, not parties and elected officials, will drive the process. Decisions are made by you, the commission, a balanced group of 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and 5 people unaffiliated with either major party. There is full transparency. All meetings will be streamed and archived, as will communications to and from the commission. There are extensive opportunities for public participation in the process, since this is an important driver of the process. Information and commentary from the public will be important building blocks in the design of new districts. The public can offer testimony at public hearings, submit written materials, they can communicate what they'd like their districts to look like, they can propose districts and maps, and they can comment on proposed maps. Finally, there are explicit redistricting criteria, which we will turn to in a minute. In all, these features of the process you will implement will bring an end to gerrymandering in Michigan. I would like to highlight one of these criteria for a moment, the one that states districts shall reflect the state's diverse population and communities of interest. Communities of interest may include, but shall not be limited to, populations that share cultural or historical characteristics or economic interests. I worked with a group of U of M students this last academic year to produce a report on communities of interest that is included in the materials you received for today's meeting. The concept of a community of interest is very important in the new process, being assigned high priority in the list of criteria. But the concept will be unfamiliar to most members of the public. So the commission will need to clarify its meaning in order to stimulate broad public participation. Another key to broad public participation will be outreach to individuals, organizations, and groups around the state, encouraging their participation and indicating what the commissioners would like to hear from Michiganders. Finally, in contrast to the other criteria, this one needs attention in the fall because public hearings must be scheduled and the public must be informed so they can plan to participate in 2021. Finding common ground on issues that you initially view differently will be important to your success as a commission. In the past, redistricting was characterized by partisanship, not collaboration. There are many issues on which finding common ground will be important. These include clarifying the redistricting criteria. As written, few of the criteria are spelled out in sufficient detail to serve as an adequate guide to their application. In many cases, multiple interpretations of the criteria exist in the academic literature and in judicial opinions. You as commissioners will have to choose among them. You must seek common ground in developing a plan to involve the public, from outreach to the public hearings themselves, and take into account public input as you go about designing districting plans. And finally, seeking common ground and adopting new districting plans is at the heart of the new process. As the first commissioners, you are the pioneers who are charged with figuring out how to make the new districting plan work for Michigan. Many people can offer advice on how you make key decisions, including an array of experts whom you'll hear from in panels and webinars. But in the final analysis, you make the decisions. I thank you for your willingness to shoulder this important responsibility, and I wish you the best as you get underway. Back to
Thank you,
Matt.
John. So for now, again, if we could do questions in the chat, and then we'll open it up and transition to live questions. I'm now going to introduce John Aguia to give an overview of the redistricting criteria. John is a professor of economics at Michigan State University and faculty affiliate at IPSR. He does research on political economy, collective choice, and institutional design. And he's authored several academic publications on voting and elections, and is now studying partisan fairness in redistricting maps. John, take it away.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you to all the commissioners for serving in the commission. So I am John Aguia, and I am just going to introduce the criteria that the Michigan Constitution lays out to draw electoral district maps for Michigan. Your maps will have to follow 7 criteria that you see here. First, they have to respect federal law. This means that your districts must have equal population, and they must obey the Voting Rights Act. You'll hear a lot more in future panels, meetings about the Voting Rights Act, but the gist of it is that the districts cannot be drawn in such a way that hurt ethnic minorities. Second criterion, your districts must be geographically contiguous, that is, connected. This is probably the easiest of the criteria to understand and to follow. Third, the districts must reflect communities of interest. As you've heard, John is an expert about as much as can be known about communities of interest by a single person in Michigan. It might be John that knows so. So I will refer questions on this criteria to him. And I would also encourage you to learn from the experience of the commissioners from Arizona and California in a future panel. Fourth, districts shall not provide a disproportionate partisan advantage to any political party. This partisan advantage is defined according to, quote, accepted measures of partisan fairness. This is an area in which I've been working on in my own research, in my own work, so I love to talk more about these measures of partisan fairness and how the academic community disagrees about them in Q&A. Fifth criterion, districts shall not favor or disfavor any incumbent or any political or any candidate for office. So not only we want the maps to be fair to parties overall in the aggregate, that was the district, the criteria 4, but we also want the maps to be fair to each candidate individually. That is the fifth criterion. So no compensation of unfairness so that our net is fair, but just a fair district by district, race by race. Sixth criterion, the districts must reflect or try to respect county, city, and township boundary lines. And then seventh, districts have to be, quote, reasonably compact and not have the odd shapes that we typically associate with partisan gerrymandering. Notice that all these criteria are ranked. So if two criteria come into conflict, the higher ranked one prevails. For instance, if a well-defined community of interest cuts across county lines, well, then you should try in your maps to respect the boundaries of the community of interest ahead of respecting the county lines, because keeping the community of interest whole is, or reflecting the community of interest is the third highest criterion, whereas respecting the county lines is only the sixth. And above all, you have to respect federal law. That is the top criterion. So with that brief introduction, I give it back to Matt, and then in Q&A, I'll be happy to engage or talk about any of these criteria in particular.
So to give a sense of the roadmap, we are going to have a panel tomorrow morning that will be wholly on that first criteria of the Voting Rights Act and federal law. So you'll get a full dose of that. And then in the afternoon tomorrow, you will get a sense of sort of the Michigan specific factors from two folks with long experience on the lines in Michigan. So this is supposed to be sort of our high level introduction to these criteria and the process you'll go through implementing them. So I'll start, I guess, with just the first question for John, since he mentioned it on the communities of interest. If he could just go into a little bit more, what is that term really mean, and what are the ways of thinking about it? We can't hear you, John.
Okay, I'm back. This is a term that many states include in their constitution or in their statutes concerning redistricting. And almost all of them say, here's a few examples, but this doesn't exhaust what we mean. And so it's up in the end to the commission to decide what communities that want to claim that they should be heard and paid attention to under this clause. What are they? There is in the report that I referenced a couple of columns of examples that economic communities, it could be tourism communities, people who live along a coast and they have a common interest. The idea is that it has to be small enough that it can be taken account of in constructing districts. There has to be a shared interest in this community, something that binds them together and makes them into a community. And it needs to be, the shared interest needs to have some connection to legislation, either national or in the state legislature, so that they are a community that has a joint stake in what the legislature decides to do. And they can be a community defined by race, by ethnicity, by history, by economic interests, by geographical location. Examples like the city of Detroit has a number of strategic economic zones where foundations have placed some money. These zones, you can find them on a map. They are working together to build communities. There are agricultural communities around the state, cherries in the Leelanau Peninsula or sugar beets in other areas where there's common economic interests that in fact come up for consideration in the state. So the list of communities of interest could go on and usually does in many cases. California being an example, that's an interesting topic to take up with the commissioners when you talk to them. It is often the case that members of a community of interest don't know what a community of interest is yet and don't know that they are a member of one. And so when the invitation goes out for communities of interest to participate in public hearings, questions, how are they going to find out they are one? They ought to show up. They ought to send in something. So the commission's job, it's not only the commission, but certainly a commission responsibility, is to figure out how you get the word out to what do we mean by a community of interest? How do you, communicate with the commission about your community of interest? And in the end, how does the commission take this information into account when they're making decisions.
So I saw that MC has a question. I can read it, but why don't you want to say it yourself?
Sure. There's two parts. I mean, we all right now, every commissioner represents the Lower Peninsula. We've got two peninsulas, and we have such, right? We have 2/3 of our population. And thank you, by the way. Sorry, I should start off with thank you. I read your close-up report, and I really appreciate it. There's a lot of good stuff in there, and I'm really interested in sort of the education piece and how we educate ourselves as commissioners and maybe model what we're learning so that we can spread the word right during this fall, so that we can educate all the voters as we're learning. But I want to, the part that really strikes me here is I don't understand how we might or might not consider the Upper Peninsula as distinct from the Lower Peninsula. And it's not, right? We're one state, but I'm just curious if that could fall under a community of interest. And because there's such sparse population, if there are communities of interest in the Upper Peninsula, should we, consider, how do we potentially, any thoughts on that, I guess is my question.
Well, I think that, for instance, the Upper Peninsula includes a number of Senate districts and a number of state house districts. So small communities of interest, they care about what their house district looks like, or what their Senate district looks like. Their congressional district, they're pretty much all going to end up, I think you have to have one congressional district, and otherwise you will violate the contiguity requirement. So I think the communities of interest there may not be very dense, but to the extent that they care about, I don't want a line drawn down through the middle of Marquette, or I don't want, my district to go north-south, I'd rather it went east-west. They can make that argument, and the commission should listen. In other places, like southeastern Michigan and Detroit, there can be, I don't know, dozens, hundreds of communities of interest. It could be very dense. I suspect that in the UP, the density of communities of interest is probably less, but that doesn't mean that people don't care about things, that they don't share things, and they want those respected. For the most part, we expect communities of interest to want to remain intact in districts. They don't want, a district line to go down Main Street and split them into two parts. Some of them may, and they should communicate that. But I think that the communities of interest lines will be drawn. The lines are, it's important that those lines respect communities of interest, and therefore it's important that communities of interest make their will known. And I think that's, something that you have to work extra hard. There may be other places where people realize that there's a bit of a scrum on whose community of interest is going to be respected. But in scheduling hearings and testimony, I think doing outreach, maybe you ought to do outreach to the areas where you suspect people might think, oh, that doesn't apply to me, or it's not about my area, because you do want that. We'd like, in the end, a map of the communities of interest to be spread around the state, not to be concentrated around urban areas or coastal areas or whatever it might be.
So John Agia, you outlined these criteria, and they all seem like positives, but you also mentioned that they sometimes come into conflict. Can you give us some practical examples of how these sometimes conflict?
Sure. So the criteria can work at cross purposes. I'll highlight a couple harder cases among top-ranked criteria. So for instance, it might be tempting to think of an ethnic minority as a community of interest, even if it's spread out in somewhat strange shapes. And then to build up race-based community of interest, construct a district that is populated almost exclusively by that race or by that ethnicity. But because they share an interest in certain ethnic issues specific to that ethnicity. However, that might be illegal too, because various court cases up to the Supreme Court had been very skeptical or suspicious of maps drawn predominantly based on race rather than other considerations of community. So communities, race can be used, but the scrutiny put into a map if race was the predominant factor is harder. So such an attempt to build a community of interest based on race might drop additional scrutiny on whether it's providing equality to all agents, or whether it's even, again, violating the Voting Rights Act, because putting a community all together might actually, in a district all packed, may hurt that community overall. Of course, it wins that district, it gets a candidate, it wins in that district, but it could be that then loses influence in several other districts, and it would be better off having representation in multiple districts. Whereas being overpacked in a single district, it loses representation overall. So that's a case in which building a community of interest based on race might come into conflict with the top criteria of just respecting federal law. At the same time, packing a community of interest defined by race that votes in a particular manner for one party all in one district might make that party that the community favors lose many other districts. So it may generate a partisan unfairness which clashes with the fourth criteria. So it's like a district that might look good for that particular community in that particular district might have effects across the state that are undesired. So in evaluating this criteria, I think it's important to look at the map as a whole. It's the map that satisfies your criteria and is a fair map or not, rather than just district by district. And then other conflicts are a little bit easier with lower ranked, bottom ranked criteria. For instance, if a community of interest, the only problem it has is that it's not very compact, that is spread out. Well, since compactness is a bottom criteria and the community of interest is a fairly high one, well, then you just draw a district that is not as compact to respect that community of interest. So in many cases, there are going to be conflicts between criteria. And I think that's where the ranking helps you, in that you resolve the criteria according to the ranking. And when you violate a criterion, it needs to be for a reason of a higher order. So this district is not compact because it's following a township shape that was not compact. This district does not follow the township because it follows a community of interest. This community of interest is being broken apart because of federal law requirement of Voting Rights Act. So any violation of a criterion that you cannot avoid, I think it's justifiable insofar as it was necessary to satisfy a higher order criterion.
So I can see people visually raising their hand if they want to ask a question. You can also just raise a topic. We don't need to. You don't have to have a formal question if you want to hear more about one of the criteria. Just let us know. You can also just type in the chat, and I'll read your question, or you can just say I have a question in the chat. So John Chamberlain, you mentioned that the hearings are this opportunity to get a sense of the state's communities of interest, but we know that hearings are not always representative of the public. Maybe the loudest people aren't always the most representative of the state. So how are they going to organize these hearings in such a way that they hear from all the relevant communities?
I think that's the real challenge. And I think one place to start is by asking the California commissioners how they did it. They managed to hear from a lot of people, a lot of times. I think there are no doubt already some organized interests within the state that are ready to go and could show up tomorrow and make their claim. They're well resourced, they have a staff, they're politically active, they know how to do this. The concern I have is that there might be a lot of real communities of interest that, fit the definition. It will remain invisible because they never figure out they're a community of interest. Nobody ever knocks on their door and says, have you thought of this? So I think that, outreach in California, they managed to get some foundation money that empowered groups to go out and, talk to communities of interest and say, here's what you might have to put together if you're going to make this claim. I think, news media, social media, the commission can't do all of this that we need themselves, but they can set it in motion, and they may be able to have some budget that they can use toward it. But in a world in which local newspapers aren't the power they used to be, there are plenty of communities that don't have a local newspaper. Radio stations, television stations, Facebook, other kinds of things will. And looking for organizations that are active within the state, they might have local affiliates that they can talk to, is another way to do it. There are lots of communities that are similar to one another that are spread around the state. For instance, there are local chambers of commerce nearly every place. So there may be affiliates of organizations that can be quite helpful in this, but this is going to take some creativity. It's going to probably take some outreach to people who know the nooks and crannies of the state of Michigan and understand how it's organized, industrial structures, labor structures, what the local economies are based on. And every state will do this differently because every state's got some fundamental differences. So while we can learn from California, we can't just pick up what California did and translate for it to Michigan. It probably won't fit in many cases. But so that's why I think it's important, and it's not easy, and there's no place you can go to look it up. The answers aren't sitting there. Raw materials may be sitting there, and it's up to the commission and its staff to turn those into explanations of the concept and make it possible for some of these communities that would remain invisible to actually participate.
So John Agia, Anthony has asked about measures of partisan fairness. So your opportunity to go through those measures. He wants to know specifically what it means for individual communities, especially communities that might be overwhelmingly Democratic or Republican, how we would judge those versus judging the statewide map.
Thank you. So that's my area of work, so I could talk forever until nobody wants to listen on this.
You asked an economist about measurement. Good work, Anthony. Now we're in this rabbit hole.
Yeah. Yes. So the partisan fairness has typically been understood at the state level. So these are cases of first the clearer cases that what's unfair, clearly unfair. If two parties get approximately 50% of the vote, as was the case in North Carolina, and then with a 50-50 split of votes, one party gets 10 seats and the other one gets 3 seats, that cries out as unfair to almost everybody on almost any definition. And the North Carolina Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court agreed and tossed out that map as just, this is unfair. So it's usually about what's the aggregate state level outcome for the party. So a party that is doing so well in the state should get something for all its votes. So I think it's more of an aggregation question. And then the question is, so what is fair? On equal votes, a 10-3 split of seats is not fair, however you look at it. But most cases are not as bad as, no case is as bad as that map of North Carolina. So it's usually harder. So on partisan fairness, typically there are two concepts of partisan fairness before I go into specific measures to consider, because this is philosophical. What do you consider fair? And you'll need to decide. First one is a notion of symmetry that comes to say that both parties should get the same outcomes based on the same votes. So this sounds very intuitive at face value initially. So if in Michigan, the two main parties split 50-50 the popular vote, they should get half the seats. That's very intuitive. It sounds fair if you don't think too much about it. So that's a notion of symmetry. But the courts have been fairly skeptical of this. They say that there is more to it. It's not as simple as saying, well, if you get a half of the votes, you should get a half of the seats, because there is something that the courts have called a natural advantage based on how voters are located. If a party has a small majority for most of the state, and another party has a lot of voters concentrated in a particular corner of the state, and it wins in a landslide in that part of the state, this party that has its voters more distributed pretty much everywhere would tend to win pretty much however you draw the maps, will tend to win a lot of districts with small majorities, and the party with concentrated voters will win a few districts with huge majorities. But drawing a football analogy, that's like beating a couple teams 60-0 and then losing a lot of games by a few points. It's not, it is better to have your voters spread out through many areas. So the Supreme Court question in one ruling, should you really be trying to, quote, reverse gerrymander in favor of the party that has all its voters concentrated in a particular area to draw to that symmetry? And that's dubious. So perhaps a second notion of fairness is not that your maps should be working hard to attain a symmetry that just isn't there. Perhaps a notion of fairness is that your maps should not be introducing additional advantages. Let a party that has his so-called natural advantage keep it, and that's fine. If they get 50-50 votes, the two main parties are not going to get equal seats. The one that has the voters better distributed is going to have a little bit more, but let's not pack on more advantage. That's your map should not introduce more advantage. So that's a notion of, well, there are unfairnesses in some sense, but if it's not due to the map, if it will happen with virtually any map, I'm going to let that stay, that so-called natural advantage stay, and I'm going to try not to pack up more advantage. Since this has a very, I'm speaking neutrally, but this has a very partisan connotation, it is very clear who's being advantaged in Michigan by this natural advantage. In a spirit of compromise, you might say, well, maybe we want to go halfway. Maybe you as a commission say, these two notions of fairness have some merit, and maybe we want to draw a map that compensates partially. So we're going to reverse engineer a map that partially compensates the natural advantage, but not fully, because it's not really the fault of the maps. You could do that too, but you should have to decide kind of which of those two approaches of fairness resonates more to you, or a mix of the two. And then for each of those two, you have specific measures as to how to quantify the symmetry notion of they both get the same outcome for the same seats, or the not packing any artificial advantage, but respecting the natural one. My work is on the latter, but there are specific measures, and maybe this is something that you can summon some of us that are arguing about this in academic circles to each other, and convey another panel down the road where you say, well, what are these measures of the particular notion of fairness? What are the merits of each? And it's not just me, there are several of us in the cutting edge of academia doing this in Michigan. So that's something, but anyway, that's my first answer, but this, I will talk and talk and talk. So this.
So as a reminder, you can also ask for written materials from people who ask. So and my institute is happy to help with that, as well as all the other panelists. So if you want a list of links to potential measures or something like that, just let us know. I think Doug Clark had a question, and we'd prefer if you're willing to state it so the public can hear it. Are you up for that, Doug?
Oh yeah, no problem at all. The question is the communities of interest discussions and hearings, and it's just not that, but emails and documents you get relative to communities of interest. It's going to introduce a lot of data. What are some of the suggestions on how this data can be assimilated and stored electronically and be made searchable electronically to try to make it easier for us to sort out community of interests?
I'll take a crack at that. That's not what I do. So getting a hold of some demographers who know the databases of the state and understand, and an archivist who understands how to archive things so that they're searchable and you can get your hands on things. I have not done much of that, but I think it's key that, and I think it would be worth, again, asking the California commissioners. My understanding is they ended up with a mountain of evidence that was submitted and didn't have time to sort it out and hadn't figured out in advance how big the mountain was going to be. So I think that it's not something the individual commissioners are going to be able to do. Probably a staff or a consultant who understands how you do this, librarians and bibliographers and demographers do that for a living. And I think they probably have useful things to say, but I don't.
So you're suggesting that we outsource that work so that it's available to us to do the searches and analyze the data?
Yeah, I mean, there may be state employees. There is a state demographer. You could start there. And there are other groups that gather these data and put them together. Probably the state demographer knows where most of these are. So I think it'd be a good place to start. You will probably get some people who are happy to provide you with data, but then you have to ask, so how reliable are these data? Is somebody pushing a particular view at us? And I think that's, again, where somebody who does this kind of work for a living can be useful. And as a consultant, or there may be other people elsewhere in the state that are good at this.
Yeah, because as I recall from reading from the California Commission, that they did have a large, extremely large volume of data relative to this, and that they ended up doing it off of memory rather than anything on how they dealt with this issue. And memory over a course of this many months leads you to some insufficiencies on this.
There's also in your materials, there are some suggested future webinars. One is on Michigan geography and one is on the math behind redistricting. But I think basically you could ask anybody that you want and we could help identify people to help. So even if you just wanted to have a data management webinar, I'm sure people could put that together for you.
Okay, great. Thanks.
MC has another question.
I'm thinking about the fairness, and I'm thinking about the terms equity and equality and related to fairness. And I'm wondering if there's within your academic circles, are there maps that can represent equity versus represent fairness? Are those terms that even applied in when you're discussing this sort of thing?
I think that comes closer to being a philosophical, normative value that most of us in our circle try to shy from, and maybe making such normative. So that type of consideration, I think, is going to be more up to the commissioners, yourselves, and your consciousness, less about the expertise. So I think the expertise of my subfield, what we would do is, if you tell us what you consider fair, we will be able to tell you how you measure that in concept, how you quantify whether a map meets that criterion or not, because there can be a lot more into equity than just equality. That goes a bit beyond the consideration. So I think that comes from a different area of expertise that I would not be as qualified to judge. We're more into, you tell us what is it that you want, we'll quantify it and tell you whether a map meets that criterion or not. That's so. But to define what's good or what's equitable, because for instance, there are issues that go beyond our calling at the panel on the census. Someone brought up, maybe some communities are specifically undercounted on the census. That's beyond we are going to use census data. So any unfairness within the census is going to get lost and not compensated. So I think addressing equity would be harder than addressing just partisan advantage is a narrower, clearer, is this party getting better off than it should or not? That's a simpler, narrower question to which we're going to be able to give more precise answers.
I'm sorry, Matt, just to follow up. Are we always talking about Democratic and we have independents on our commission? Like, is there ever an independent? Yeah, advantage or is that the toss up or the
concepts? That's okay. That's easier answer. That's if independents grow up to have enough votes through an independent candidate, and in some races they do across years. Rarely in Michigan, but there are places where they do. Then it would be about the independents. So no, it's not a bipartisan question. It's easier to think of in terms of the two top parties because those are the two that are getting all the seats in Michigan. But in principle, most of the measures will be able to account for independent or a third party. So there is nothing Republican versus Democrat. That part is easy to deal with. It's just that for convenience, since your practical problem here appears to be mostly about Democrat and Republican, but should a third party be getting votes in such a way that they could win seats, then it would apply to them just as much. That would be much better covered than the equity question that is much more profound. But yeah, third parties or independent candidates, their measures apply to them as well. The idea would be if they're getting the same votes as a party, then they should be getting the same seats as the party.
I was just going to add one distinction that is made in the research that's sort of related to this equity fairness is that if a party were to win, say, 65% of the vote, one common notion of equity might expect 65% of the seats, but most maps are going to give that majority party well over 65%. And so part of the fairness measures that John was talking about is sometimes we measure, instead of measuring, do they get 65% of the seats, we say, if the other party were to win 65% in the next election, would they get the same number of seats, even if it's above 65%? So that doesn't match the philosophical discussion, but it is sometimes a distinction that people make.
And I do think that fairness comes up probably more often in these debates than equity. That, in fact, I think one of the first Supreme Court decisions in the 60s said something to the effect that the objective of redistricting is fair and effective representation. And they didn't define what either of those terms meant. And people are still arguing.
Did anyone who hasn't, by the way, if you don't have your video on, you can just interject because I can't see the hand raised. But did anybody have a chance to try any of the redistricting games that we sent out? Any reflections from that or questions that came up from that?
It was hard.
What were you trying to do, and what was hard?
The games. I wish I could remember which one it was, but there was a salamander, the gerrymander, and there were like boxes, and I remember going through the questions and trying to answer the questions, frankly. And I think it had a lot to do with fairness, and it was last weekend, so I may be getting foggy, but that's what I got.
John Agia, the one thing that we haven't talked about is that they'll have to judge the plans before any elections. And a lot of these measures tend to wait for the elections to look at fairness. So what are their possibilities for that?
So the easiest is to look at how would your plans have performed if applied to the previous cycle. So just use the elections from the past. So if we you convene another webinar and we talk more about these measures, anyone will be giving you results as to how did the 2010 maps ended up performing. And then you can put a hypothetical map and how the people voted in 2012, 14, 16, 18, that hypothetical map would have performed in this way, according to this measure, according to the last 4 elections. Or you can also do hypotheticals as to if voters were to vote like this, then this is what would happen in this map. So both approaches are used, either past electoral results or just made up hypothetical results that you're interested. Well, I'd like to know what would happen with this map and this vote. And so this may sound very overwhelming, but I want to interject a positive message here of there are many measures, and we academics will argue bitterly over nuances of this or that. But in the end, bad maps come across very poorly in virtually all measures. So we have very vehement discussions as to the merit of one measure versus another. But that detestable North Carolina map looked detestable however you look at it in any measure. The last Michigan map for Congress also performed poorly in virtually any measure. And I'm pretty sure that the map you are going to come up with is going to perform much better according to any measure in the land, even if you never heard from anyone. Again, one needs to be working on purpose to create a bad map so as to end up with the bad outcomes that we had. So even if you were to learn nothing about fairness, you would create a map that is much fairer than the last one.
Other questions or reflections on trying any of this yourself? John Chamberlain, how should they be planning out their timeline here? It looks like a lot of time now to wait for the census data, but it's going to come at them pretty fast. So how should they be thinking about the early hearings and the map making and the hearings afterwards?
Well, I think that it's going to take a while in the next month or so just to get organized. That the census data are going to get released at the end of July. So you're not going to be able to do precise line drawing before you find out where the people actually are. So I think the fall is a good time to, plan an outreach program, communicate about communities of interest, decide which measures of the various criteria you will use, because the amendment requires you to test each proposed plan to see how it does. So very few of these, with exception maybe of contiguity, all of these things need to be interpreted, and you'll get different answers when you ask that question. So I think settling some of those questions so you can communicate them to the public to the extent that it helps the public, a community of interest or an individual, make an argument of the kind you think fits with your thinking about it is important. And I think that John's right. You can get a parade of experts to come through. In the end, you're going to end up with 2 or 3 variations on the way to do it, each of which has a logic. You could use all 3 of them for partisan fairness. Then you'd have to figure out, what do I do with 3 numbers instead of 1? So I think that planning the outreach program and trying to settle some of these definitional questions and just catching up on what the inner workings of redistricting are like will occupy most of the fall. But come winter, some outreach should have an impact. Public hearings can be held. Whether they'll be in-person meetings looks less likely. But how are you going to do these such that they don't get dominated by, particular parts of the state if you're doing them online? Or do you organize them geographically and still do them online? And providing examples, you could create some examples of communities of interest and plausibly think about, so what would this community, what could they tell us that would be relevant? What is their shared interest? What binds them together? And show them more than just a half a dozen examples, do a lot of them. And California can be helpful in that regard. So I think the fall is largely a planning exercise, that the winter can start with hearings. And at some point, you want to start pulling this stuff together and starting to think about general shapes, not worried so much about, you might do it with township boundaries. You'll end up breaking some townships, but they're small enough. You could try to put some pieces together and think about, is this consistent with what we're hearing from the public? If we use these data, what would partisan fairness look like? Getting used to those measures and then saying, well, suppose if we wanted to do something about that, learning about, well, take a township, move it next door, or cut the township in half. how do you go about adjusting your plans? In the end, you'll get a lot of plans that people submit. And I think those plans presumably will be based on, if not really old data that's a couple of years old. You won't be able to rely on it being perfect. So worrying about, which street does the line go down is probably not a useful exercise in the spring, but getting general shapes and asking, so what do we think about that? And inviting people to comment on them is probably a good way to start. And then come June, get serious. Come the end of July, then it's got a breakneck speed to get it done in time. So you can't wait till the census data come in to start thinking about how are we going to do this. You need to have had some discussions among the commissioners about some tentative plans. What do we think of that? What does it look like? What might be its problem? How could we adjust it? Knowing that none of these are final decisions, it will help you in the end when you get the data and you see that plans that we thought looked okay, turns out there are more people there or fewer people there than we thought. How are we going to adjust them? And this process is when you adjust one district, you have to adjust the districts next to it, which adjusts the districts next to that. So it's a chain of dominoes in many cases, and you have to have a little practice with that so you don't throw your hands up and figure we're never going to get this done. We'll get it done. It's just that this is a much harder exercise than you might think at first glance.
Yeah, I think it does help if you have some time to play around with some of the games and models, just to see that, just to see if you're trying to fix one problem, you may have created some difficulty for yourself elsewhere. So feel free to wave questions. John Aguia, I think the inclination is that a community of interest might want to be in one district, but can you talk a little bit about the trade-offs with that? Say if we're looking at state legislative districts, pretty small districts, what would be the trade-offs between kind of having a community of interest that dominates one state legislative district versus has some influence in several? Your mic is off.
I touched upon it a little before, but the advantage of being in a district where a particular community dominates the entire district, is that it is going to be able, if that community behaves politically as a bloc, that they all agree what they want and they have common interest, well, they're going to get whichever candidate exactly they want, not more or less. There are no compromises. They dominate that district, so the person that represents them will be exactly whoever they want. However, the drawback is that they're losing influence potentially in several other districts. So maybe an alternative scenario is, instead of total dominance in one district, if that community is put differently in 2-3 districts, maybe it has a heavy say on more districts. So each community is going to depend, the case of each community is going to be different, and it's going to depend very much as to how its preferences align or conflict with that of other communities around it. But as a rule of thumb, I would say that for a community is going to get most political influence if it is spread among several districts in which in all of them it is very influential and it can win. It can be in the majority coalition. So maybe say the land scenario, if it ends up being in 3 districts, but in the winning coalition of all 3, it's going to have a lot of influence. On the other hand, the worst that can happen to a community is to be spliced and split into districts into which it ends up losing. So being in its own district is an intermediate case generally, where at least you get that district and you get the candidates you want. If you're going to be split in multiple districts where you have a big say and you have the ability to influence the outcome or to be in the majority coalition, you're going to end up with more influence. If you end up just cutting to various losses in other districts where you have no hope and you're ignored, then that's a loss of political representation. So I think it depends community by community, but it's not it's just not obviously good to put a community together. And again, that's one of the tactics of gerrymander maps, is to be packing a community, overloading a district into landslide victories. That benefits no community. So once a community already has 55% of a district, packing even more, that's not advantageous. So it's gonna depend community by community, but the general rule of thumb would be, if you can be influential in many districts, that's better than being influential in one. And the worst thing is to be cut into a losing position in multiple districts. I would also say that, back to what John was commenting, I would imagine that it depends, does that community want to be together? So I would be very cautious to start creating communities of interest of your own imagination without that community wanting to be together. So that seems to me the most incautious approach. If a community wants to be together, well, maybe that might trump the fact that it has less power when together than if it were apart. So I think it's a mix of, is it actually helping them to be together, or would they be better off apart? What's their alignment with other communities, and do they want to be together? John, do you want to qualify or add on to?
Well, we just have 3 minutes left, so maybe we should open it up and make sure that there's not further questions. All right, John, if you do have comments, or maybe if you get to it in your comments, maybe you could talk a little bit about reaching agreement across partisan lines. This group has to reach consensus. How do they get off on a good foot versus a bad one?
Well, I think on that latter point, the way to have a good second step is to have a good first step. So, the end game of this is you're going to have to vote to adopt districts. And if partisanship has gotten in the way a number of times along the way, it probably will come up again. That you're there not as representatives of a particular party or of, the people in between, but you're there as a citizen of Michigan. You understand that you need to work to find common ground, or if you don't, this process may come to a halt and end up in picking something out of a hat, which would be an unfortunate first outcome for this process. So I think that being sensitive to differences of opinion as you start talking about things, don't say, well, that looks like we can't agree on that, let's move on to something else. Find some things and work it through as to what would middle ground look like on this. Is there a way, and then, rather than saying, well, I'll let you win this one and I'll win the next one, look for common ground. And the more successful you can be early on, the more confidence you will have in the rest of the commissioners and in the process, and the more confidence the public will have in you, because they'll be watching this. So if it looks to them like a bunch of partisan squabbles are breaking out at meetings, they're probably going to, think maybe this process doesn't work. So I think you need to worry about the fact that you're doing all of this in public. If it happens in the legislature, in a conference committee, they can yell at each other and pound the table. That's probably not an appropriate way for the commission to work. And so finding things early on that you can agree on to cement the common ground and build from there. It's not what I do for a living, either studying it or doing it much, but I think that's what I hope the commission will find a way to do.
Well, thank you. So first of all, we're all available for future written answers if you have additional questions. There's also 2 institutions represented here, the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research at MSU and the Center for Local, State, and Urban Policy at the University of Michigan, which are both happy to engage in research on your behalf if you give us some moving forward. And I think lots of people will be willing to help. So I think for now, I'll turn it back over to Steve.
Thank you, Matt. I would like to personally thank John Chamberlain and John Aqua for their excellent presentation regarding the mapping, the communities of interest, which I'm sure over the next several months that we will become extremely familiar with, and hopefully we'll get off to a good start. I cannot think that we won't. From our introductions earlier today, I think that we all are on the same page as to where we're going. So that brings us to our next 10-minute break. So we'll see everybody back here at 4 o'clock. That's 9 minutes, and that's close enough. See you back then.
For the members of the public who are watching today, Department of State staff is going to use this time to make sure that the upcoming panelists are good to go in terms of their audio and slide sharing capability. So upcoming panelists, I'm going to ask you to unmute and turn on your camera so that we can make sure that we are able to see and hear you.
Hello.
Hello. Let's see.
Hello.
That's my champ.
Okay.
This is Vince Braub. I guess you start your video. Start my video. Okay. There we go.
There we go.
Magic.
Perfect. All right. Sounds like your audio is working, Cynthia. Nice
Yep.
to see you.
Good to see you too.
Colleen, do you want to test your audio and unmute yourself?
Hi, Cynthia. Hi, Sarah. Good to see you guys.
Good to see you again.
Wonderful. Okay, Andre, are you able to turn on your video? And
Yes, I
awesome.
am.
There he is.
Hi there.
Hey, everybody.
Make
All
sure my
right.
Hey, Andre, you have a, I don't know if you can shift your computer screen a little bit. There you
Yeah,
go.
the light.
Otherwise, there's
Okay.
too much reflection
Very good.
from the window.
Sure. Got it. Okay.
So do you all want to practice sharing your slide, or at least sharing your screen, so you make sure you've got access to it while we're waiting for the commissioners to get back?
Sure, I'll do that.
Awesome. I think that works.
Good.
All right. Colleen, did you want to try as well?
Sure.
Or would you prefer for us to share them? Either way works.
Yep. No, it should work. I used to have a bandwidth issue, but we'll see if it works today.
There you go.
Awesome.
Okay, great. I'll plan on enlarging that. The menu is kind of right in front. Let me just.
Great.
Sorry, it took so long.
Looks good.
Okay, great.
Thanks, everyone. Kathleen, would you mind putting back up the break slide? And panelists who are joining us, just so you all know, I know you can see a lot of people's names with their cameras turned off, but just so you're aware, the public who is viewing can only see people whose camera is turned on. So if you were to turn off your camera, they would still be able to hear you if you unmute yourself. But in order for the public to be able to see, you've got to have that camera on. And we have other people on this call who are staff whose cameras are turned off, but all of the commissioners' cameras will be on during your presentation. All right, so we still have about 5 minutes of the break, but I'm glad everybody's audio and video is working and looking forward to hearing from you.
How did the morning go?
Well, it's going. This is all publicly live streamed, so it's been even right now. So we have said to the public who's watching, we are grateful in advance for their patience and understanding as we facilitate this meeting virtually. But it's going, hopefully for all well so far.
That's great. Good to hear. It's an exciting day.
And the fun's just about to start.
All right, I'm going to turn my audio and video off, but I'm still here, and you guys can feel free to, if you need anything, put a message in the chat.
That's good. Thanks, Sally.
Panelists, just got a question from Cynthia that I thought was worth mentioning to all of you. So because of the screen share, you might not be able to see all of the panelists at once unless you do a particular setting with your screen. So I'm just gonna provide these instructions if it's helpful to you. So if you hover your mouse over the top of your screen, it will say you are viewing Kathleen's screen. Right next to there should be a view options drop down. And if you click on that, you can click on side-by-side mode. And if you click on side-by-side mode, you'll be able to see both the PowerPoint slides on one side and the commissioners and other people who are on camera on the other side, and you can drag that to be able to view more people at once. And during the meeting, once the chair convenes us again, the commissioners will be on camera.
Okay, it's 4 o'clock and we are back from our break. We have another panel discussion scheduled on lessons from California and Arizona commissions. per our, for that. And we have, who do we have as a moderator?
Hi, Steve. So no formal moderator for this session, although I'm happy to quickly intro the panelists and then hand it over to them if that works for you.
That would work for me. Go right ahead, Sally.
Fantastic. Hi, everybody. Just a really brief intro to these panelists because I want you all to have the maximum amount of time possible to talk to them. We have 3 commissioners from the California Commission that was convened in the last redistricting cycle, as well as a commissioner from the Arizona Commission who similarly was doing the work of being a commissioner last cycle. So we'll first hear from the 3 California commissioners, and then we will hear from the Arizona and then the commissioner, and they all have allotted a lot of time to be able to answer questions from all of you as a part of this time we have. So California commissioners, if you'd like to take it away, that would be wonderful. If you're speaking, you're on mute.
Good afternoon, commissioners. Congratulations from the 2010 California Citizens Redistricting Commission to the new Michigan Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. We are done with our 10 years of public service, but are pleased to share lessons with you as you embark on yours, thanks to a grant from the Harvard Ash Center. I'm Cynthia Dye, a Democrat from San Francisco. I've had the pleasure of visiting your fair state twice, somehow both times in the middle of winter, in support of voters, not politicians, successful campaign to end partisan gerrymandering. You can see I'm wearing the long down coat that I only use in other states from our last trip in March before COVID. And now, of course, that the weather's finally fine, I'm visiting virtually and will now get to enjoy Detroit bold coffee with fresh pita bread and baba ganoush from New Yasmin Bakery, fortunately. You and your compatriots have been entrusted with a great responsibility to draw new electoral districts that will last a decade. You've been chosen to be different, yet you must collaborate to succeed. 10 years ago, we were in exactly the same predicament. This was us. We looked so young then. Like you, we were chosen to reflect the full diversity of our state. In addition to being diverse by gender, race and ethnicity, geography, and socioeconomic status, we also had among our ranks business and nonprofit execs, military vets, small business owners, professors, attorneys, urban planners, a farmer, and a homemaker. We spanned 4 decades in H. Political pundits predicted that we would crash and burn. Yet we did not. Why? It was apparent that despite our differences, we were united in our desire to draw fair districts for all Californians. With this common goal, we were able to overcome many challenges as a team. We also knew that we would only be successful if we could agree with a super majority vote on the maps. We started with team building. In fact, one of our first acts was to develop the tagline, which you saw on our opening slide, Fair Redistricting, Democracy at Work. This was truly a collaborative effort that every commissioner participated in that we were all proud of. We had many informal opportunities to bond with what I call enforced socializing. We had a rule that we all ate dinner together and drank lots of wine too after meetings on the road. Since we were not allowed to discuss redistricting outside of a public meeting, we were forced to only discuss our personal lives, thus getting to know each other very well. Many of us carpooled to meetings around the state, giving us opportunities to socialize in smaller groups. It is true that those who play together work better together. The friendships we formed with one another enabled us to truly listen and have the sometimes difficult conversations when we did not agree, respectfully and civilly. We recognize that it was not practical or efficient to have everyone do everything. An early decision we made was to share the burden of leadership. The Constitution requires the chair and the vice chair to be of different parties. So we decided to rotate. This drove our staff absolutely crazy, but Californians loved it. It made it clear to the public that this was truly a nonpartisan commission. We also divided ourselves into 5 standing committees, each with at least 1 Democrat, Republican, and independent, while also taking advantage of the expertise, skills, and interests of each commissioner. We formed ad hoc SWAT teams of 2, always of different parties, to work on special needs that arose, which provided flexibility around open meeting laws. By dividing, we conquered an almost impossible timeline. Last but not least, we operated by consensus, rarely voting unless absolutely required. Consensus means that everyone has been heard, and while you may not agree on every detail, you're willing to move on with the will of the commission. We triumphantly announced our final maps at the state capitol with an almost unanimous vote of 13-1 on the legislative maps and 12-2 on the congressional districts, forcing our critics to eat their words. Now I will turn it over to Vince Barava, who will share his insights on the census and how to use data.
Thank you, Cynthia. Well, I really enjoyed this opportunity to come back to Michigan. My connections with Michigan goes back to 1966 when I worked on the campaign that elected your longtime congressional and Senator Don Regal to Congress. I should also mention he was a Republican at that time. So I learned a lot about Genesee County and the significant differences between Flint and Bloomfield Hills. I was the director of the Census Bureau between 73 and 76. And I came back to conduct the 1980 census. And after that, I worked at the Eastman Kodak Company. In 1985, I moved to Michigan and worked at General Motors in Detroit. I lived there till 2003 when I retired. My last house was in Bloomfield Hills, and my first residence was in Detroit in an apartment house at Brush and Larned Street. I finally remember my walks to Greektown, going to the Astoria pastry shop, pick up a bag of macaroons. Now let's get to the problem at hand. Redistricting is not easy, but it can be done. One of the critical components is access to geographic data and the ability to visualize it quickly and share it with groups that are interested in the activity as the commission is. One of the critical data components is the census. It provides the official count of the data that you must use in congressional districts to create districts of equal size. The census data will also provide characteristics of the population, such as race and ethnicity, and socioeconomic data, which will help you satisfy the characteristics of important criteria of the community of interest. Though it will help, it will not provide all the information you need. You have access to other sources that can provide additional information. You had the individuals from the University of Michigan Database Research Group, the Michigan State's Information Center, and I'm sure there are others as well, but that is only part of the problem. Because we were required to, in California, as you are, a requirement of creating communities of interest. This is where the interesting part of the commission comes into play. In our case, as Commissioner Parvenu will discuss, we held meetings throughout the state and discussed with community members what they considered as their community of interest. And let me provide an example of how an open discussion led to the identification of a community of interest that was not available in any of the data sets that were available to us. Our second visit was in Northern California, where we met with people from the surrounding counties. Because this was one of our first meetings, we did not have a lot of time to reach out to the different population groups in the area. At one point we asked, because of the limited publicity, if there were any interest groups that are not in attendance but should be considered. At that point, one of the participants commented that the Sikh community was not in attendance, but their interest should be considered. I must admit that as a person who was raised in California and was involved in planning many political and organizational campaigns, I had no idea to find out that there was a Sikh community in the state. Not having any idea of how large the community was, we asked if anybody had an idea of the size of the community. Another participant got up and said there were at least 10,000 Sikhs in the area, and they played a very important part in the farming community through the efforts and success in bringing rice farming into the area. A woman got up and stated, we should also consider the Hmong community because they all play an important part in the agricultural activities of the area. Another person pointed out that every year the Sikhs conduct the biggest party of the year globally for the last 4 years in that community. The Sikh information, by the way, was not available in the census, and we would not have known about it. But when you see the size of the Sikh community in this area, you could understand why we were really better informed to conduct a community of interest. That was not just because they were Sikhs, but they were Sikhs who were interested in farming, and even in a particular form of farming called rice farming. And it looks like you have a similar but better known community of interest in the large Middle Eastern residents of Michigan. And let me turn over to Andre, who will discuss how we reached out to our communities and how you're going to have to do that because the information about Middle Eastern residents is not available from the census because the census does not indicate religious information. So Andre, take it away.
Yes, thank you, Vincent. And hello, everyone. My name is Andre Parvenu. I'm your no party preference representative from the state. I'm currently a resident of Los Angeles, and I'm a geographer in urban planning. That's my background. I'm so pleased to be with you all today to share a few words about community outreach, and especially outreach to underrepresented communities. I too have my ties with the great state of Michigan. I'm a former resident and I attended graduate school at Michigan State University in East Lansing, and I also took a few courses over at Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan. So I'm part Spartan and part Wolverine. So I'm sort of like the cars that you all export. I was partly built in Michigan. So I'm glad to be a part of this conversation. The first slide here you see shows public outreach. As Vince just shared, this was one of the most important components of our process. And to a great extent, our commission was successful because we took our public outreach efforts very seriously. We were indeed, or were at that time, a citizens redistricting commission with an emphasis on the word citizens. So we could not have done this, we could not have done what we did without our community partners. Our community partners included, in our case, we had our nonpartisan good government group folks like Common Cause and the Advancement Project, the League of Women Voters, and all the others that we're all so familiar with. We were very fortunate to have, as I heard you all discuss earlier, our foundations that contributed greatly towards our effort. But we also had our reputable and credible community-based organizations and special interest groups. And the range was extensive. I can think of at least 40 or 50 organizations or groups that we worked with throughout the state. It included environmental groups like the Sierra Club and the League of Conservation Voters. And we had the California Coastal Commission involved. In the Silicon Valley, Commissioner Dye's area of expertise, we had tech-related organizations. We've had in the Central Valley, for example, we had agricultural-based organizations, school districts, water basin districts, chambers of commerce. The San Fernando Valley, we had business interests, we had industrial parks. We even had hemp growers associations on our team, providing their input as well here in California. So of course we had our various ethnic group organizations as well, representing the various Asian, Latino, and African American populations. And for example, in Los Angeles, we have a large Korean population. East Hollywood, we have Armenian. In Glendale, we have an Armenian population. We listen to all the voices that we invited to our public input meetings. California is a very diverse state demographically, as we all know. And while perhaps not quite as diverse, Michigan has its own pockets of diversity. So what we did was we wanted to make sure that we listened to everyone and that we were as inclusive as possible. Can we see the next slide, please? Okay. To encourage civic engagement and to the fullest, we developed information materials on how to, for example, how to provide public testimony. Keep in mind that in most cases, this was the very first time that state officials had ever come to them and asked them about anything. Actually, this was the first time in history that this type of experiment in democratic reform had been attempted. So we wanted to make sure that we were organized and that we had information so that the public testimony participants were also as organized when they presented their concerns to us. We made sure that we published our materials in multiple languages. We hired language interpreters. We did all the standard activities that you would imagine, the sign language interpreters, TDY, etc. We also made sure that we used multiple forms of outreach. We placed announcements in various local newspapers and radio and other methods. Right now, well, then in 2010, we didn't have the extensive social media platforms that we have now, but especially in this COVID environment, you need to be very creative in your approach, as you all know. So with the next slide, with the earlier slides, you saw that people were saying, keep Fremont and Alameda County. And the one that we went back to there, that was our bacon, yeah, right there. That was our bacon cry everywhere we went. Basically, it was keep our community whole, don't split our community. What we experienced from previous redistricting efforts, which in some cases were a mess. In some cases, we had neighbors that lived within several blocks of one another, and sometimes even right directly across the street that had different representatives. So we served to fix that, and I think we did a pretty good job. Here's another example here. This person is saying, keep our community intact. Okay, this is an example here. What you're looking at is an example of what happens when we indeed listen. As Vince mentioned, we had 2 phases of public input. For community outreach. In our first phase, we went around to find out what we thought or our initial input about what the communities of interest were. We did a various iterations of our maps. In phase 2, we circled back around and after receiving our public testimony, and we were very pleased. Many individuals that attended the second round, and this is an example, we're very pleased that we actually listened to them. So we did receive positive impact. It wasn't really just a negative experience. It was positive, a win-win situation all around. We can go to the next slide, please. And let's see. Okay, yes. How did we do this? Incorporating public testimony. We did this by holding 34 public hearings. And some of these hearings, by the way, lasted from 10 to 11 o'clock at night. Some even surpassed midnight. So we were very, very diligent about this. We received over 2,700 testimonies from speakers and 70 deliberation meetings, again, very much involved, all open to the public, as we all know. And importantly, we received over 22,000 written comments. And I heard it mentioned earlier about how we dealt with this volume of information. We had our staff aggregate some of the information so that we had certain themes, and they did this work before we arrived at the various venues so that we had a general understanding of what the concerns were after being lumped together. So we did all of this within 9 months. So we were very busy over that 9-month period. We also chose to, at that time, all 14 of us traveled together so they could have a good look and feel of what our commission looked like. Okay, the next. Okay, before I go here, I want to say this, that we were particularly challenged in some of the more urbanized areas of the state, particularly Los Angeles, the Bay Area, and San Diego, where the population was more dense and diverse. We had a situation where the various ethnic groups, the major ethnic groups in these areas, could have presented, where they were prepared to submit individualized versions of what their respective communities of interest looked like. They could have proceeded with their various maps individually, but we let them know that if they had done that, one or several of the groups would be very unhappy and disappointed with our ultimate decision. So we suggested that they discuss their communities among themselves, their communities of interest, and what they came up with was a unity map. This isn't it, by the way, but the unity map proved to be very helpful to us. And I understand New York has employed the same approach. What you're looking at here is an example of how a previous packed district was unpacked to allow greater Latino representation. We actually created 1 or 2 additional Latino districts, and this happens to be in the San Gabriel district just east of Los Angeles. And you can see what it looked like before. And secondly, you can see what it looks like after we unpacked. The area to the left shows the various Latino communities, and it was like 80–90% Latino. But the one to the right has a slightly larger than 50% majority minority Latino population. That allowed us to look at surrounding communities and create more communities, districts of opportunity for that particular population. And this happened all over the state. And it impacted various, for example, in San Gabriel, the Asian population also had similar concerns. And that's what we did there. I just want to say that in closing, that this is one of the more challenging and interesting opportunities that you'll have in a lifetime. I wish you all well. It is an experience that you will certainly relish over your lifetime. And I wouldn't go back and do it any other way. And I'm really looking forward to the outcome of your success. And passing it on to Colleen now.
Great. Can everyone hear me okay? I'll go ahead and share my screen. I love the nods. Hello, everyone. Just getting this up. Great, can you see that okay? So my ties to Michigan are not as deep, certainly as Vince's, but, and I don't have any ties to any fabulous bakeries, unfortunately. I'm feeling hungry, but my mother did graduate from Grand Rapids High School and attended MSU for a little while, if that helps. And then also I had the great opportunity to meet Nancy Wong. When she came out to Arizona, she's a member of Voters Not Politicians. And a couple years ago, Arizona hosted a conference to talk about independent redistricting. We now have 20 years under our belt with independent redistricting, and we thought it would be great to share some lessons learned from this past decade. So I had the opportunity to meet Nancy, and I'm trying to advance my screen. This quote, after just having seen the Slay the Dragon movie, the documentary, made me think of you all instantly. I just was so proud to get to meet Nancy and learn about the Michigan story. Kudos to everybody who made that happen. I know it takes a village. Arizona went through it in 2000 when voters back then decided that they wanted to take the task of redrawing these lines away from the legislature and put it in the hands of an independent redistricting commission. And it happened to pass with 56% of the vote. I didn't live in Arizona back then. This was in 2000 timeframe. But I wanted to share with you all the language that was put in front of the voters that caused them to vote for this. Because I think it's important for our commission that I'm the chair of the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission only until probably March of this coming year. In fact, I just met this morning with the Commission on Appellate Court Appointments, which is the entity that vets all of the people who apply for our commission. So we're a little bit behind Michigan in our timing. They're in the process, they're in the stage right now of choosing from a pool of 138 applicants. So we're really excited to see what happens next. But I was presenting to them this morning the story of the commission and a little bit about, what makes a good commissioner. And a lot of it echoes what you heard from the California commissioners. But overseeing the mapping of fair and competitive districts is language that I really took to heart. And as chair, I viewed that as our mission. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. But the process itself, these were the 5 original commissioners in Arizona that were chosen. 4 of the 5 commissioners are appointed by majority and minority leadership. So I know that's different from how you all handled it and in California too. That's just how this is stated in our Arizona Constitution in terms of how those folks are chosen. Anyone can apply. We're all citizen volunteers also, and we're not paid. We get reimbursed for travel expenses. But beyond that, it's a lot of work and very little pay, but a lot of glory. So you guys should be really excited for what's about to come your way. It's just like Andre said, I wouldn't exchange opportunity for anything. I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. Our commission is structured 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and the independent. The independent could be from any party that isn't a Republican or a Democratic party. So I happen to be independent, not affiliated, but you could be a Green Party or whatever. And these were the 5. Setting up the commission, you're starting up a state agency from the very beginning. And so there's a ton of work involved. You guys are probably all prepared and ready for that, but I will reiterate, just for the Arizona experience, especially for the chair, there's a lot of administrative work that you have to get accomplished in a very short amount of time. And frankly, I think you're always going to hear the clock ticking, because the precinct people are going to come knocking on your door saying, hey, we need those lines now. And you're like, well, we're not even done with the draft map. So, it's a very pressure and intensive period. So from about March of 2011 until January of 2012, it's all hands on deck to get that done. So it's intensive, and I just remind everybody that just try to be as flexible as you can when your poor staff is trying to set up meetings for you all, because trying to get, we had five schedules to coordinate. You guys have a lot more. So I wanted to share with you the requirements that our state constitution lays out. A lot of them are probably similar to language that you have. The first 2 definitely, since they're federally mandated, and everybody across the nation complies with those. The rest are standard redistricting criteria. You see, we also have to respect communities of interest and do some of the things that California did. But we also had this last one, favor competitive districts. And that's the language that's in the Constitution, where no significant detriment to over other goals. So competitiveness is something that is kind of unique to Arizona. There may be a couple more states now that are bringing that in. But it's, at least when we were doing it 10 years ago, it was pretty unique. And we'll talk about this briefly. 2 of the criteria. The best example you could ever have is the one that Vince gave you on the Sikh population. That's so fabulous. And it resonates with me because, we were, as citizen volunteers, we weren't redistricting scholars. We certainly had no preconceived notions of what a community of interest was, except for Native American reservations. That was a very unassailable, kind of obvious community of interest with defined boundaries. So it was an easy one to view as a community of interest. But beyond that, we got definitions of all kinds of things from people, some questionable, frankly, and many very legitimate and things we hadn't thought of. So I encourage you to keep an open mind when you go out and listen to your population in Michigan and let them tell you what their communities of interest are. Competitiveness, you may not have to worry about as much, but it is one that was big for us because of this factor that we had to consider. And all of our criteria, I understand yours are ranked in terms of how you consider those criteria. Ours were not. They were, in fact, the Arizona Supreme Court had to rule on this due to some litigation, that essentially all of our criteria are equal. That makes it really challenging, I can tell you, because those criteria compete with each other. And I just thought a picture's worth 1,000 words. And this picture is actually the commission's map from 10 years ago, my predecessor commission. This was the congressional district map. We only had to draw 8 back then. My commission drew 9. We're hoping for a 10th. We'll see what happens, but we drew 9. And this was the map from 2004 to 2010. And it just illustrates so well the problem with these criteria and executing on what the language in your constitution says. Because if you note that District 2 there, it's got that crazy kind of island in the middle of the green, and it's attached via a line essentially to this other part of District 2. It's really unusual. And that happens to be the Hopi Reservation in the middle there. It happens to be completely surrounded by the Navajo Reservation in Arizona. And for whatever reason, the Hopi went to the commission and said, we don't want to be in the same district as the Navajo. And they're like, wow, well, this is going to be really hard. And they figured out a way, though, to comply with the contiguousness requirement. You have to be connected, but yet put them in another district. And so the point of showing you this is, and this is, of course, competing directly with the requirement to be as compact as possible. That blew the compactness scores out of the water. But it shows that communities of interest matter, and you need to listen to everybody and see what you can do to accommodate as much input as you can. That's kind of how I view the role. And you can't always do that. There's no way, but you do your best to try. And this is what the last commission ended up, to their credit, producing. My commission didn't have to do this. For whatever reason, the Hopi and the were okay with being in the same district as the Navajo. But it's just a great example, I think, of another point too, that bad shapes do not necessarily mean bad intent. You might look at that and think, oh, that's a gerrymander and it's horrible. Well, it was done for a really good reason, and it was to respect a community of interest. So try to keep that open mind, and factor that in as you go through the process. I hope you'll remember this map as an example that helps. We did a very similar thing to California. We went on a listening tour first, traveled to 25 different locations around the state, and just had the public tell us what communities of interest were to them, what competitiveness meant, what mattered, frankly. And then we went back and drew our first lines. So a big success of our commission, and I'm sure California would say the same thing about theirs, is having a really good website. I'd recommend you guys do that because it is the portal to the commission for everybody. And we really tried to make it easily accessible for people. They could stream meetings live from our website. Those are all archived. You can go out there now, azredistricting.org. I'd encourage you to visit it, and maybe you'll get some ideas for things to incorporate in yours, or maybe things you don't want to do, either way. But I think it's instructive to look at. People could submit maps online too to us, and did. And so it also just created a great record. We transcribed every one of our meetings and our hearings and our executive sessions. We had a vast record, and we're really glad we did, because unfortunately, one thing that independent redistricting does not do is keep litigation out of the equation. There will be lawsuits, and the more prepared you are with a record to show your deliberations and documented the evidence, the better you are later on. Not to scare anybody, but I think you guys do the same thing. You'll be starting from a clean slate. You can't consider incumbents' addresses, and you go through an iterative process. Arizona has one. It's all laid out in the Constitution how we do this, but all these lines are adjusted in public session, just like those great pictures California showed you. And it made our maps better, frankly. It's just, hearing from the public on the lines we were drawing, and we'd even do it in real time with them. We drew out both congressional and legislative district maps, just like I understand you'll be doing. We only drew 9 congressional districts. We drew 30 legislative districts. This map is more complicated because you're drawing 30 districts, but that map got, we did that second after we did the congressional district map. We had a similar kind of statistical approach to, how much public input did we actually capture from these meetings. We had numerous opportunities to engage with the public. And I thought I actually presented this morning to the folks that are vetting the applicants, because, some of this is everything you learned in kindergarten kind of thing, but it's worth thinking about and mentioning to all of you as you go embark on this amazing process that you're about to start. You're going to have really long days, as you heard from California. We had days all weekend where we would spend 9 hours each day trying to get the maps drawn. So tempers can flare, frankly, and you're also getting some very heated exchanges from the public, and it can wear on you. And so, to the extent you can have a steady temperament and try to realize. Just be open-minded and listen, and all those things that you heard about from California apply to Arizona, the same exact thing. Despite everyone's best efforts, you may not, things may not go as you planned, and that definitely did happen to me. I was removed from the commission for a very brief time, thankfully only for 2 weeks, while the Arizona Supreme Court waited to hear my case. But I was reinstated, and it was thanks to a very courageous judicial branch and the press. I think if, to the extent any press is tuning in today, being there and being a witness to what is happening in these meetings and reporting on it is really important. And having that courageous judicial branch is key. Hold public comment at all your meetings. You're probably planning on that. I would give you one word of advice, that we had to move our public comment to the end of the meetings because, unfortunately, the meetings were so contentious at times that the public would take over the meeting, and we couldn't get our business done. So we learned after that happening once that we hold public comment at the end, and that way the people who legitimately have input they want to provide to the commission, constructive input, they're going to wait and do that. And it gets rid of a lot of distraction and noise and allows the commission to get its work done. I talked about all of these things. The staff is super important too. We had an excellent staff, and they helped us navigate the process. So I know you have independent procurement authority. We did as well, and you should exercise that authority very well too. Hire well. There's additional resources out there that you all know about, I'm sure, just by Googling redistricting, but a couple I'll point you to. If you want to hear more about our story, there's a great podcast that 538 did, and they actually cover 6 states. California's in there too. And it's a really instructive, interesting podcast that you might want to listen to. And then secondly, I co-authored a paper with some folks from Harvard Ash Center, and they published it. And there's some great lessons learned in there about that go into more detail about our commission that might be useful. You're always welcome to reach out to me anytime. I'll be a resource. And I would recommend, if any of you don't have a pet, you might want to consider getting one, because I can tell you that in my situation, our pet was my biggest fan, and a great thing to come home to every night. So I wish you all the best in this, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. That was amazing to hear all of your reflections. California folks, if you want to turn your videos back on, I see you're doing that. I'm going to step back and let you all engage with each other. I'm happy to call on people, but Michigan commissioners encourage you to just unmute and ask away.
I don't have a question, but it's a comment. I just kind of wanted to thank you all for sharing that, because it really brought to life our responsibilities at MC and what we can expect. It's one thing to embark on this journey and have an idea, but that made all of the sense to me. I was doing all of the head nodding. And so Arizona and California, you all were truly phenomenal. So thank you so much for sharing that with us today.
Yeah.
This is Steve Lett. I'm the temporary chair. I appreciate you guys spending your time and sharing with us as we embark on this. One of the questions I had, and obviously obtaining information and organizing all that is important. How did you obtain or get or pick or choose consultants on map drawing, on geographics, on demographics? How did that come about?
So
Anybody?
in California, you know, we, it sounds like Arizona, we're actually a separate state agency. And we had to follow all of the, you know, California state government rules on putting out requests for proposal. So that's a process that our staff managed to put out RFPs and then accept proposals and score them. And this, of course, was all done in a public meeting. I will say the choice of our line drawing consultants probably followed closely by, or maybe exceeded by, the choice of our legal counsel. Were probably among the most controversial decisions that we made as a commission, but it was all, you know, the discussion was all held out in the open, and you know, the public watched us debate and had their chance to weigh in as well, and that's how we did it in California.
Arizona has independent procurement authority for the commission, but our commission, in order to instill public confidence in the process, thought it would be wise and helpful to actually use the state procurement office's process and do an RFP and do the things similar to what Cynthia said. Unfortunately, it didn't work as well in our situation, and I think all 5 of our commissions by the end agreed that we would not do it the same way again. We would just exercise our independent procurement authority, figure out a process on our own to interview candidates for these positions and hire them, because it ended up being, it didn't work well with the state procurement office because they had so many confidentiality requirements around sealed bids and all these things that kind of it flew in the face of what independent redistricting and openness is all about. So it was a problem, I will say. And I agree with Cynthia, it was definitely our most contentious hires. I will say we ended up hiring Republican and Democratic counsel as the independent. I actually didn't want to do that. I wanted our commission to choose one law firm because I felt like it was a waste of taxpayer dollars to have 2 sets of lawyers sitting at the table with us at every single meeting. It didn't make sense because they represent all 5 of us. But I was outvoted. The 4 of them were like, nope, we want R&D counsel. And that's how the first commission did it too. So that's what we ended up doing.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, for California, we picked one. We had our general counsel, you know, who was a staff person, but we picked a firm to ensure that we complied with the Voting Rights Act. We ended up with a firm that was, you know, traditionally considered to be a Republican firm. However, the partner who they nominated to work with the commission is African American, and you know, convinced us that he would be able to do a fair and impartial job. And you know, I would say that the commission's maps were, and I, you know, love for Andre and Vince to jump in too, that they were moderate, right? I mean, I would say that we did not draw as many minority districts as some groups would have liked us to draw, but we drew enough that we prevailed in court with multiple unanimous Supreme Court decisions in favor of our map. So the nice thing about a commission that has a supermajority vote requirement is you end up with a moderating influence. You end up with something in the middle.
Yeah, I would just add that one of the aspects of the criteria is we were not allowed to use party registration data in the that was available. We could not use it in the drawing of our districts, and that really made it a lot easier to draw districts that were not identified in a partisan or nonpartisan way.
How many in Arizona or California, how many lawsuits ended up being filed? If you know.
I can attest to ours, at least for Arizona. There were 5 major lawsuits, essentially, 2 of which went all the way to the US Supreme Court. One of them had national implications because it was regarding whether independent redistricting is constitutional or not. And fortunately, the court deemed that it was, and it was a very close vote. It was 5-4 decision, and some California commissioners I know were there because they were watching closely. Because
yeah, we filed an amicus brief in that one.
Yeah, exactly, and we had, I think, 14 amicus briefs that were with multiple parties signing on to each of those. And what was so cool about that was Republicans and Democrats all got behind that. I think that's the important thing to think and to keep in mind through this process is that the power structure in every state. I come from Illinois, and you know, the Democrats are wholly in charge there and have managed to keep independent redistricting off the ballot for voters to vote on, and that's unfortunate in my opinion. So they like independent redistricting in Illinois, but in Arizona, the power structure is such that the Republicans are currently in charge, and anybody who is you know, in charge isn't going to like independent redistricting, especially if there's a competitiveness requirement involved where we're supposed to favor competitive districts. So it's just a side note to that.
So thank you, Arizona.
Well, yeah, and I'd encourage you guys to actually check out those legal briefs, because it is pretty interesting to see how that came down. And also it's neat too that the US Supreme Court is now using independent redistricting as a remedy for states to look to. So I think they've kind of come around to thinking, gosh, this is, yeah, why don't you guys try this and do it this way instead? So I think it's encouraging.
And in California's case, we had 4 major lawsuits, which, like I said, we won in 7-0, 7-0, 7-0, 7-0 decisions in our favor. There were some minor ones that were thrown out and dismissed. Some still pending.
And were they primarily over the drawing of the lines, claiming they were somehow unfair?
There was one major one, which was brought by the Republican, a representative of the Republican Party against our Senate maps. And they brought suit at the Supreme Court in the California Supreme Court. And they also put it up as a referendum, and they lost both of those cases. Also, there was one against the composition of the commission, objecting to our using race as one of the factors in ensuring a diverse commission. Andre and Vince, do you remember the other 2?
Yeah, I was going to just mention what you just stated there, Cynthia, about the Ward Connolly one about using diversity as a criteria for our commission. Vince, did you have any comment on the others? I'm not as
I don't.
Okay, I'm not as familiar with those others as well.
MC, you had a question.
I got a couple, but I want to start with the idea of what you're one of the things I think that in the materials we got from you all was that reach out to the legislature and understand, like, so I'm wondering if you all had experience in order to try to avoid this sort of situation. Did you all, as individuals or as commissions, reach out to your legislature to try to just, I don't know, yeah.
We were not allowed to speak to, legislators were not allowed to speak to the commission outside of a public meeting.
And you go ahead.
So we had some folks testify in front of us like any other member of the public, but no, we were not allowed to talk to them, and they were not allowed to talk to us.
And that created an interesting scenario when it came to getting supplemental funding. None of the legislators wanted to deal with it. Say, total hands off. So we can request any money or anything else. So what we got dealt with in the beginning was what we had to work with financially in terms of our budget. So didn't want to touch us at all.
So we know what we're up against, don't we?
Yeah, I would say in Arizona, we had to unfortunately send our executive director hat in hand to the legislature to request more funds to defend the commission in suits that they were bringing against us. So it was crazy. And it was sad, frankly, that we had to keep going back to them for more money all the time because they wouldn't fund us. They gave us very minimal seed money to get started. And then it was up to us to keep going back and asking for more money, which, you know, created a spectacle. So it was too bad. But,
Yeah.
and I would say also just back on the lawsuits that our commission was successful in all 5. We had a clean sweep and prevailed in all of them. So it's important that you stay encouraged. But
Yeah, well, it's important that you extend the winning streak of independent commissions against people who bring lawsuits against them. So just to clarify, in California, our starting budget was $3 million, which was based on what the legislature officially spent on redistricting, which of course was done in a smoky back room with no public input and no roadshow or anything like that. And I think it ended up costing us about, what were we at? About a little over 10 million.
10 million.
So we did go to the legislature and get money. And fortunately, in our constitution, they're required to fund us. They're required to give us money to defend against litigation and all that. So I'm pretty sure Michigan's constitutional amendment is modeled similarly.
Yeah. MC, you had some more.
So the second question, or maybe, is the idea of the website. One of the questions that's been posed to us in the orientation materials is should we stick with the state sponsored website, so to speak, or should we go with an independent? And I guess I'm wondering if you found that there were advantages or disadvantages, and how you all decided to go with which address.
we did face that exact conundrum when we started out too, because the state had offered to host that, and we thought that's kind of fraught with peril in some ways, given they were sort of adverse to us even from the beginning. So we weren't sure how to handle that. I think the way it worked out was the Secretary of State's office did host the site for us, and I think they still do now. But I'm not sure. I'll check that for you and supply that back to Sally, because I don't know the official ownership of the website currently. I know we've been successful in getting them to keep it up because we want it to act as a resource for everybody. And so it's a great question and one that you should consider.
And in California, like I said, we're another state agency, so we use state agency resources. The California Auditor's Office, who was responsible for the selection process, had created a URL, wedrawthelines.ca.gov, and the minute the commission was selected, we took it over. And it's the underlying infrastructure supported by California's Department of Technology. We also, by the way, did create a Facebook presence immediately, because it took us months to get control of our website because our procurement ability was not independent and was dependent on state processes, which were running far slower than the commission needed to run. So we went ahead and did our own Facebook thing just to have a way to communicate with the public while we were waiting to wrest control of our website away from the state.
Doug, you need to unmute.
Yes. I've noticed that you've both states have hired a number of consultants to help out in the process. How did you make the determination of what areas that you needed consultants in and what areas you didn't, and were you dependent on maybe Secretary of State resources or other government resources?
So,
Okay, go ahead. Either way.
yeah, again, so we're an independent state agency, so we're not supported by any other agency.
Okay.
So we had to hire our own staff. The line drawing is a very specialized task. Even the legislature hires their own consultants, so you're going to have to go out for that. The requirement to hire independent Voting Rights Act counsel was specified in the Constitution, so we went out for that. You know, we use independent videographers, but we had a staff, so we mostly hired, you know, state employees to do the operations and, you know, handle RFPs and procurement and.
Okay. So where you saw a need, you went out and hired a consultant?
Well, like I said, we generally use our own staff. We only hire consultants where it made sense to hire consultants, and a couple of them are required.
And one of the benefits we had as well was that we have a statewide database that is operated by the Assembly, but it's located at the University of California, Berkeley. And they were really well prepared to fundamentally answer any of our questions as it related to the census data and about the state of California. And having access to that volume of information and in the form in which they had it was extremely helpful.
And we had decided to break down into various subcommittees so that we had finance and administration, we had public outreach, public input, community outreach, we had a legal subcommittee. So those individuals among us who were best or most qualified in determining what our internal needs were that surpassed what we were capable of providing ourselves would bring those issues to our general meetings, and we would discuss what our overall needs were, in addition to what we were provided initially.
And in Arizona, it's a bit of a hybrid. Initially, the state did help us with like the Arizona Department of Administration. The AG's office provided legal counsel. They helped us find office space, things like that, and get our staff hired. But once that occurred, once we had a staff, we then hired technical consultant, the mapping, and then legal consultant. And part of that was just based on, we knew what the previous commission had done. And so following in their footsteps, we knew we needed those two things. And Cynthia mentioned an important thing too. We also hired a voting rights expert because Arizona had a special hurdle to clear being pre-clearance, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And so we really wanted to make sure that we could clear that hurdle, and we wanted to hire somebody with a lot of expertise in that area. So that was part of our legal team.
And just to clarify, we had Voting Rights Act counsel, and then we also had polarized voting expert.
Oh,
So,
and we did too, correct. Yeah. Same thing, to do the analysis on racially polarized voting.
Right.
So those are two separate consultants that you had?
Yes.
Okay.
Usually the people who perform racially polarized voting analysis are academics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, ours was.
Okay. And for example, let's take the budget, for example. Did you have one of your people deal with the budget, or did you get somebody from the state to deal with it?
Oh no, we had our own, you know, state agency. So we had our own staff to do all the functions that we needed.
Okay, so one of us would do the budget and keep track of the budget and so forth?
No, when I say us, I mean our staff.
Okay, I got you.
And our staff handled it too. We had an executive director and deputy executive director, and they handled the budget almost exclusively. So
Okay.
they report on it at all of our
Yeah,
meetings.
they hired accountants, they ran the operations, they made sure they picked our, you know, venues, they made sure they were set up before we got there, you know.
Okay, so we do that type of situation or organization so that we can spend our time analyzing data, collecting data, doing the mapping and so forth.
Yeah, you're decision makers. Your staff are going to do all the operational piece.
Correct. Okay.
And having the staff have a keen understanding of how the government operates and what information is where was very, very helpful.
Okay.
Okay, we've come to the end of our time on this. I want to thank Colleen, Vince, Cynthia, and Andre very much for taking time out of their day to help neophytes in Michigan who, depending on which ad you're listening to right now, we're either really brilliant or really stupid. We'll probably figure it out before we're done. But again, thank you very much for that. And we have come to a break, and we'll take 5 minutes and we'll be back here at 5:05.
Yeah, don't worry, you'll all be brilliant by the end.
Yeah, exactly. Don't worry about the names you'll be called. Thanks for the opportunity. Take care, everyone.
Good luck, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good. Do you think that was good? Excellent. Woo!
Okay, it appears we have everybody back. And at this stage, we move into the final agenda item, which is the public comment. A few notes about public comment. If you were just happened to be joining us, because this is a virtual meeting, members of the public had to sign up in advance to address the commission. Staff at the Department of State will unmute each member of the public who signed up to provide public comment for up to 90 seconds on a first come, first served basis. When your time has elapsed, we will allow you to finish your sentence before we move on to the next speaker. And I am told we only have one speaker. And it's my understanding that that is Anthony Scannell. And if someone will turn Anthony on, we would be happy to listen to his comments.
Hello. Good evening.
Hi, Anthony, this is Sally Marsh from the Department of State. You are unmuted and able to address the commission for 90 seconds.
I appreciate it. This is a abridged version of the written comments I gave, but first off, yeah, just congratulations to everyone here in the Secretary of State's office. Everyone's doing a great job. But I just see this as overall taking back control of our democracy as a state and as a country, as people do it state by state. And as I see it, this two-party hegemony currently dictating policy in the country is perhaps the most destructive force in our society, if not just our politics, as it gives way to an endless back and forth finger-pointing, blame passing of accountability to decisions made in the course of governance come each subsequent election, pointing of blame. Even the presumptions of this very commission's conception are based on the faulty pretext of a certain composition of Democrats, Republicans, and independents, as if those could accurately accommodate a country of about 330 million people. The next steps to regain control of our democracy are to rid the elections of bottomless corporate money, to enact a form of ranked choice or runoff voting so that we may have the choices we deserve in presidential, legislative, and other elections. And congratulations again. Thanks.
Thank you, Anthony. We appreciate your comments today. Are there any, that was our only public comment, and that basically is the end of our agenda. Are there any comments or questions by the commissioners? Head nods, anything? Okay, well, I want, number one, thank Anthony again for participating as a public comment. And at this stage, unless anybody has something else to bring for the good of the group, I would entertain a motion to adjourn. Somebody.
I'll second the motion.
I will do a motion.
Who made the motion?
Dustin.
Dustin, you make the motion?
Yes, sir.
And second, Anthony, are you seconding?
Yeah, I'll second it.
All right. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed, the same sign. All right, the motion is made, seconded, and carried unanimously, and we will see everybody tomorrow morning. Sally, can I talk to you off either on the phone or somehow, but still keep the site up?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Commissioners,
good
if
evening,
you have any questions before tomorrow, feel free to call or text or email our team at the Department of State. Thanks for your time, everybody.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Everyone have a good night.
Good evening.
See you all tomorrow, bright and early.